Here I have the body of a pieced quilt that needs 2 borders. The first thing you need to do is to measure the length in 3 places. I always start with the middle, and you want to make sure that the quilt is laying flat and has no puckers. And here you have a measurement of 66 5/8 of an inch. The next measurement will be on one of the edges, so I'll pull the tape over, making sure the quilt is laying flat and that it's not stretched and that it has no puckers. And then we'll write down the measurement, and it is coming out at 66 5/8. Then the next measurement is repeated again on the other side of the quilt, and I use a 120-inch tape measure, which makes it very easy to make these measurements. And this side comes out to be 66 3/4, almost 7/8, a little bit of difference. Once you have these 3 measurements, you need to determine how long your border is going to be. In this case, the middle and one side were the same at 66 5/8. The other side was 66 7/8. That's a fairly minor difference and can easily be eased in, and it could also have been measurement error. One other thing to consider is how long the quilt is supposed to be. In this case, I have 11 rows of 6-inch blocks, so the quilt should be 66 inches plus a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each end, which makes it 66 1/2. Since I am less than a 1/2 inch difference in all 3 measurements from what the quilt should actually be, I can easily correct this by making my border 66 1/2 inches long. Next, cut the border strip the desired width. If you do not have a piece long enough, as in this example, you will need to piece the border strip. In most cases, I prefer a bias seam. It is less noticeable and has less bulk. To make a bias seam, take the 2 pieces and align them with right sides together, perpendicular to each other. Take care to line up the raw edges exactly. Then pin the 2 pieces together. If desired, you may want to draw a line to help you sew a straight seam. I find that imperative on the wider borders. Then you will sew a seam along where I've made that pin from that bottom corner to the outside corner there, and then when you open it up, you will have your bias seam. Here is the sewn seam, and then you also want to press it to one side to give it some strength. If you have enough fabric, you'll want to make that strip a couple inches longer than what you need. The first thing you're going to do is just place a pin arbitrarily about 1 inch, maybe 1/2 inch from the end. This is going to give you a little bit of a fudge factor down the line in case you need it. Then with your measuring tape, make sure you line it right up on that pin, and then measure down the length of your border to the other end to whatever you've determined the length of your border to be. In this case, we're going to make it 66 1/2 inches. At the mark, you'll want to place another pin. So here I'm placing a pin right at 66 1/2 inches. And now you've marked from one pin to the next the exact length of the border that you want. Next, you will lay the border strip right side to the right side of the quilt, and you'll want to line up the end of the quilt right along that pin and place a pin there to hold it in place. And know that that little extra piece of fabric on the border is there in case you can't ease the entire length of the quilt onto the border. Then you've got a little bit of extra border there to help you out with that, and that's on both ends. So then go to the other end and pin the quilt where the other pin is, and then just lay the quilt and the border together here and start pinning. So I like to start on each end, and once I've got it laid and smoothed out, then I'll start and put a pin in the middle, and then start putting pins between the end and the middle, and just keep pinning until the entire border is pinned to the quilt. And I like to use a lot of pins. This is what keeps the border from shifting on the quilt when you go to sew. So I like to make the pins no less than 3 inches apart. Do this until the entire border is pinned. Next, take your quilt to the sewing machine, and with a 1/4 inch foot in place, sew a 1/4 inch accurate seam. And I like to remove the pins so that I don't break a needle and don't bend my pins. I also like to use a stiletto to help me ease that quilt top onto the border and keep those raw edges aligned. And I do remove my pins as I come to them and nudge that border there, keep them aligned. You want to just go ahead all the way down until you get to the end of that seam, and then just clip your threads. Next, you want to cut off that excess border fabric, so line up a ruler on both edges accurately and then just cut that off. I find trimming the borders before pressing makes it much easier and straighter. You'll want to repeat the trimming of the borders on all 4 ends. Once you have all of the borders trimmed, then you'll take it to your ironing board and press them open. Press the seams to one side, to whichever side you desire, but make sure you are consistent on both sides. Once you have the long sides attached and pressed open, then you'll want to measure the quilt in the same manner you did in the first place. So we're measuring on both ends and the middle. And in this case, it looks like it's about 53 inches on this end. Then measure the middle as well. And in this case, it looks like it is 52 7/8. And the final measurement on the last side comes out to be 52 3/4. Next, measure like we did before on the other borders, and on this border I'm going to place a pin at 52 7/8. After the borders have been pinned and sewn on, then you'll trim like before on all 4 ends. Then you'll want to press the border open, making sure you're consistent with the same direction that you pressed the other borders. Once your first borders are sewn on and pressed, then you'll want to measure again all 3 places, including those borders. So you'll measure the edge, the center, and the other edge, starting with the longest side first. And in this case, it looks like it's around 71 inches. And then the last edge also measures at 71 inches. Repeat the measuring procedure by putting a pin a little ways in from the end to start, and then on the other end place a pin at the measurement that you came up with for all 3, which in this case is 71 inches. With right sides together, place the quilt top right next to that pin in the beginning, and then again at the pin at 71 inches, and pin all the way down along the length of the quilt until it is fully pinned. Sew this border on like you did the first border, and then repeat on the opposite side. Now that the outside border is sewn on 2 sides, next you want to measure again in all 3 spots, including those 2 borders. And here you can see the first measurement is right about 67 inches. Go to the center of the quilt and measure again, and write down that measurement, and you can see here that it is right at 67 inches. It's always nice when it turns out to be the same. Then on the third measurement, which is the far side of the quilt, with it laying flat, it turned out to be 67 inches. So the next thing you want to do is put that pin, giving yourself a little fudge factor there, and then measure down your border until you get to 67 inches, and that's where you'll place your second pin. And then that little extra on each end is your fudge factor should you need it when you're easing. Now that the last two outside borders are sewn on, I like to press before I trim. This way I can line up my ruler on the inside edge of that border and then the far outside and make it very square and then trim off that excess. Now I have a nice square corner, and you'll want to repeat that on all four corners. To check your work, you can measure your quilt once again in all three spots across both directions. So you'll be measuring it 6 times and just see how square you are. Are all the measurements within a reasonable amount or are they off? If they are within an inch, inch and a half of each other, most long armers such as myself can manage to ease that in on the long arm. If it's beyond that, beyond 2 inches, it's very difficult, and we'll need to check your work again and see if you can get those eased into a more square quilt. So here's my finished product, and it came out, I think, within 1/4 of an inch or so all around, which I was very pleased that that turned out. So this is my finished quilt, and it is now ready for quilting. I hope you've learned something about putting on borders. If you have any questions, you can always give me a call or shoot me an email.